Introducing the Canada First TFSA top-up.
So there you have it. The Conservative government is actually proposing to increase the TFSA limit to $12,000. So that is an extra $5,000 on top of the already existing $7,000, which means that we could put a lot more money now into these accounts every year, which is pretty awesome. But the catch is that $5,000 of extra limit is actually going to have to be allocated specifically towards Canadian companies. Now, the whole idea behind this extra amount of $5,000 every year is to actually help support Canadian businesses. Making that extra portion exclusive to Canadian companies is going to help stimulate Canadian investment, because currently a lot of Canadians love to invest in US stocks and ETFs, just like myself. So that's why it's going to be an initiative that's encouraging Canadians to put more into the Canadian companies and Canadian businesses and all those stocks that work within the funds as well. So if you don't know already much about the TFSA, I have a video that I posted that explains it all in detail. But the TFSA is a tremendously powerful account. It's like the best of the best that we want to use for our tax-free retirement and creating that tax-free money. It's so valuable. So TFSA, very quickly, it's basically an account that allows us to invest into various qualified investments. And any money that we take out is completely tax-free. Now, unlike the US accounts like the 401k or the Roth, there are no withdrawal limits and there's no penalties. There's no strings attached. So the TFSA is extremely flexible. And this is what makes it such a valuable tool for you, for anyone that's looking to grow tax-free money for retirement. Now, just as an example, if you were investing in the top 500 companies in the US using something like a Vanguard VOO or a VFV, if you like the Canadian dollar version, this would be some of the returns that we would see over the past several years. And if you look at, for example, in this table, we can see last 10 years, the annualized compound rate of return was about 14.2%, right? So that's a very good rate of return. And a lot of Canadians, they like the US companies because it's more attractive in terms of the rate of return. It's a bit more aggressive as well. A cumulative return will actually show you over the past 10 years, it would have been a 278% return. So if you just invested a set amount of, say, $10,000 over the last 10 years, it would have actually went up by 278%. So that's actually 3.7 times. Right? If that's confusing, it's because a 100% return is actually 2 times, you're doubling. So a 278% return is actually 3.78x, or 3.78 times the original amount. So that would be $37,000 approximately. If we take a look at this article from CBC, we can see that some of the political history around the TFSA actually, it was actually first introduced by Stephen Harper. But he wanted to raise that limit to $10,000 at one point. And then, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberals decided to dial it down back to $5,000 because they actually argued that it was only making the rich richer. And some of that might actually be true based on this information and this data. If we look, what we can see here is that basically the article suggests that there's an estimated 2% of all Canadians actually have maxed out both their TFSA and RRSPs. But when it comes down to the TFSA, since only about half of all eligible Canadians have any TFSA at all, that means somewhere between 4% and 5% of all eligible Canadians actually max out that TFSA, which is pretty sad, considering that account is really extremely valuable for anyone to really make sure they're filling it up. Right. So if you can, work hard and have a side hustle, make some extra money, put as much as you can in the TFSA and make sure it's growing, because again, that's the best place to start, especially if you're not necessarily a super high income earner where you really need those tax deductions on your RRSP. Now, when it comes down to using accounts like TFSAs, the best thing that we're doing here is taking advantage of compound interest. Compound interest is quite literally the best thing in the world when it comes to finance. And if you haven't been taking advantage of compound interest vehicles like ETFs or mutual funds or other ways to grow money in compounded ways, you got to make sure you're doing so. Now, here's a perfect example of that compound interest. If we started with just say a $12,000 investment and we wanted to grow that money over the next 30 years at an 8% compounded rate of return, we would end up with $120,000. If we add an extra $7,000 to that, assuming that we're just putting that into our TFSA room, then we calculate, and now we can see we have $977,000, right? And if we increase that to 10%, well, now we're looking at $1,475,000 at an aggressive 10% rate of return. Now, again, if we're actually doing 12,000 every single year, that is going to be much, much different. We're going to have a significantly higher amount of tax-free money within that TFSA, hence why this proposed extra $5,000, making that TFSA limit 12,000 is going to be so valuable if it comes into force.
A common-sense conservative government will let Canadians contribute an extra $5,000 to tax-free savings accounts for investments in Canadian companies. Here's how it would work. Nothing about your existing TFSA would change. You would still get your normal $7,000 limit, which you can contribute and invest anywhere and however you like. What would change is that you could contribute an additional $5,000 a year as long as that $5,000 gets invested back into Canada, supporting Canadian companies that employ Canadian workers and pay Canadian taxes. The tax system already defines these kinds of Canadian investments, and my government will create a definition that will let financial institutions and advisors tell you which investments can go into your Canada First TFSA top-up.
So, of course, this is going to lead to a little bit of confusion with the CRA. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of figuring out, and tracking and monitoring how actually these investment companies are picking the right funds that are qualified because of that rule with Canadian investments only. So, this is going to be a bit of a tough decision for the CRA to figure out if this is going to actually work and how to do it, but I'm sure that it'll be very beneficial. But most likely the CRA will rely on existing criteria when it comes to classifying whether or not investments are Canadian companies or other companies from other countries. And an example of that is generating 50% or more of revenue within Canada would be more qualified within a Canadian investment. So in terms of recommended investments for that extra 5,000, if you can manage to make that happen, there's a lot of different ways to do it. We're going to talk about some passive options that I would suggest and that would be actually good, ones to look into for yourself. So let's take a look at a couple of my top picks. So starting with the Vanguard VCE, this is kind of like the Canadian version of VOO, or of course VFV, which is the Canadian currency version of VOO. And of course, we looked at VOO already. VOO is essentially our S&P 500, whereas the Canadian equivalent, so to speak, would essentially be our VCE. So you can see the actual rate of return cumulatively over the last 5 years compared to the S&P. Instead of 104% on the left side here with the S&P, we can see it's done about 76% with the Canadian version. So that's not too bad, especially, given the fact that Canadian companies have not grown nearly as much as US companies. And comparatively to the last year, it actually is pretty on par, mostly due to the fact that US companies and stocks have cooled off quite a bit in the last quarter or so. So you can see it's done about almost the same rate of return in just the last 1 year, which is nice to see. The last 5 years, obviously, there's a bit more of a discrepancy, but then year to date is where we really start to see the true colors between, the US companies versus Canadian as well. Taking a look at what this fund is it's an ETF. It's got very low management fee. It doesn't even include the dividend as well. So that return does not include that extra 2.78% 12-month yield on dividends, which is very, very good. And you can see in terms of what it invests in, there's 52 total holdings. The cumulative rate of return, annualized rate of return the last 10 years, it did about 9%, which is great. You can see. And if we go down to some of the companies that are in here, I would assume that based on this type of holding, as we can see, we've got Royal Bank, Shopify, TD, we've got Enbridge, Brookfield, Bank of Montreal, Canadian Pacific Kansas City Limited. So a lot of really strong Canadian companies that are very high yielding in dividends and are generally quite stable as well when it comes to long term, especially banks. And even right now with falling interest rates, banks are becoming more and more attractive to be looking into as well. Now, for anyone that's close to retirement or nearing it that wants to get more of a dividend yield, we may want to be looking more into something like a high yield fund, such as this VDY. So this is one of my favorite for dividend. Again, it's not going to be as high growth and aggressive in terms of the rate of return. But if you look at the last 1 year, it was very comparable to our VFV. The last 5 years, it again is very comparable to not only our previous one, but also the VFV as well. And if you take a look here, this is a Canadian high dividend yield type of fund. So if we kind of look down here, we've got very low fee, about 2.2%, and about almost a 4% 12-month yield on dividend. In terms of rate of return, it's done good. But if you look at some of the companies also, we can see here, it's a lot more focused in just strictly dividend yielding companies. So RBC, TD, we see some of the same ones, but again, the whole basket itself is really focused on those high yielding dividends. That's why we're going to get a really good consistent rate of return on something like this as well. Next up, again, we have another fund that I really think is a good one to look into, that is good for tracking the TSX. So that is your XEI. Again, this one, it's comparable. It's not nearly as good as in terms of rate of return, dollar for dollar, as our VFE over the last 5 years. However, this fund here with BlackRock is actually a very good option if you're looking to get some really high dividend yields. So this one, you can take a look more into it. In terms of total return, it's very consistent, not super volatile. Good yield, very strong fund. It's medium risk. We've got companies like Suncor, we've got TD. You're going to see a trend in a lot of the same overlapping companies within all of these, but you're just getting slightly different exposure in different markets, depending on what you like, and also to what kind of matches your objectives and your time horizon. Now, another good pick in terms of getting high dividend yield is going to be your XDIV. So this is another BlackRock high quality dividend. So as you can see, this one's done quite well. If we look at the 5-year rate of returns, done about 13%. And if we look again, it's medium risk. It's similar to the last one. It's just, again, it's going to have a little bit more exposure to energy. It's slightly different. It's not too much different from the last fund we looked at. But again, we're just getting more diversification, more spread. If you wanted to even mix a couple funds in there, if you're trying to get more consistent dividends, this could be a really good thing to add in there because we're exposing a little bit more to that energy sector. So this is really, really solid for that Canadian management. And I would really assume that this fund would be qualified within that extra $5,000 of TFSA limit. So as much as I did not want to make this a political video, that's not my intention. I do want to emphasize that I hope liberals also implement something similar because I think that this is overall just a really great rule. And I think this is really going to help us out as Canadians a lot. It's also going to help the economy. So if we can help, whatever party does end up winning, hopefully encourage them to actually pass this as a bill, that would be a really, really good thing. So let me know in the comments what you think. If you think it's a good idea, if you're going to be taking advantage of it, if it comes into force, and kind of what your opinion is on the upcoming election as well. I would love to hear from you. Hope you guys have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.